My name is Evelyn Carver, and I was 39 years old when I spent every dollar I had on a dead gas station outside Renfield, Kansas. It sat 10 minutes off. The old US 56, past the soybean fields and the rusted county sign nobody bothered repainting anymore. The pumps were gone, the windows were cloudy with dust. The roof sagged over the service bays like it was tired of holding itself up. The place used to be called Miller's Cross Fuel and Service, but by the time I found it, most people just called it that wreck by the highway. My family called it worse. My father, Russell Carver, looked at the deed like it was proof of a disease. "Smart people buy land with a future," he said. "You bought a corpse with parking lines." My mother, Mary Ann, kept her purse clutched in her lap and whispered, "Evelyn, you don't have to humiliate yourself just to prove you're independent." And my younger brother Preston, the golden son of Carver Commercial Properties, leaned against the wall and laughed. "You always did mistake rust for opportunity," he said. I signed anyway. $68,750. 14 years of savings, gone in one stroke of a pen. When I checked my account in the parking lot afterward, I had $127.43 left. They drove away before the ink was dry. 5 years later, those same 3 people stood inside my glass office at mile 56 motor stop, staring past my desk at the expansion maps, the logistics contracts, and the framed county permits on the wall. Preston was not laughing then. His voice cracked when he said, "You can save this family with one signature." And that was when I understood something I should have known, years earlier. They had never thought I was worthless. They had only hoped I would believe it long enough to stay small. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet you're watching this video right now, while lying down with your legs crossed, right? If that's true, type 3. If not, type 4. Let's see whether I got it right. Alright, enough talking. Let's begin the story. Before the old station ever had my name on its deed, there was Carver Commercial Properties, and in our family, that company was treated less like a business than a bloodline. My father had built it from 3 aging storefronts into the kind of firm people in Renfield spoke about, with lowered voices and careful smiles. If Russell Carver wanted a parcel rezoned, people called it development. If he wanted a road widened, someone at the county suddenly discovered a traffic concern. He did not have to demand respect. By the time I was grown, the town had already learned to hand it to him. Preston was raised to believe all of that would one day be his. Nobody said it at Sunday dinner in so many words, but families have ways of making a truth visible without speaking it. My brother was invited to lunches with bankers before he understood a balance sheet. He stood beside my father at ribbon cuttings in suits my mother picked out for him. He was introduced as my son Preston, with that proud weight in my father's voice that made strangers turn and shake his hand twice. I was introduced differently. "This is Evelyn," my father would say. "She keeps us organized." For years, I mistook that for appreciation. I handled the work nobody photographed, but every project depended on. Permits, vendor contracts, utility transfers, insurance renewals, county deadlines, stormwater packets. I knew which clerk needed a second copy, which inspector hated incomplete forms, which lender would panic if a document arrived late on a Friday afternoon. I was useful, and in my family, useful was close enough to loved that I accepted the difference for too long. The break came over a retail project on Maple Ridge Road. Preston was managing it because Dad said he needed room to grow. 2 days before submission, I reviewed the drainage packet and saw the runoff calculations did not match the engineer's revised plan. The retention basin was too small. The county would reject it. I emailed Preston, printed the warning, and left it on his desk. He pushed the packet forward anyway. 3 weeks later, the permit was denied, the lender froze the next draw, and a tenant walked. In the conference room, my father held the rejection letter like it smelled bad and asked how I had let this happen. I looked at Preston. Preston looked at the table. That was when I finally understood the rule. Preston's mistakes were treated like growing pains. Mine were treated like character flaws. By Friday, my office key no longer worked. They did not push me out because I had failed. They pushed me out because I had seen the truth and refused to file it under loyalty. After that Friday, I learned how quiet a person can become when she stops trying to be believed. I took an operations job with an auto parts chain outside Kansas City, opening stores before sunrise, handling delivery schedules, inventory errors, employee callouts, vendor disputes, and the kind of customer complaints that always seemed to arrive 5 minutes before closing. It was not the life my family respected, but it was clean. No Carver letterhead. No family meetings where my brother's mistakes somehow became mine. No father watching me like usefulness was the only part of me worth keeping. For 3 years, I saved like a woman building an exit, one paycheck at a time, $40 here, $90 there. A tax refund I did not spend, a Christmas bonus I pretended I never received. By the time Miller's Cross Fuel and Service appeared in a county listing, I had enough to buy something small, ugly, and completely mine. I studied the property for 6 weeks before I made the offer. The tanks had been removed years earlier. The title was clean. The roof needed work, but the structure still stood square. It was not pretty. It was not impressive. But it was reachable, and that mattered more to me than beautiful. The closing was on a Friday morning in a title office with beige walls, weak coffee, and a clock that ticked too loudly. I arrived early with the cashier's check in my purse and found my family already there, arranged like a jury that had reached its verdict before the trial began. My mother sat with her coat still buttoned, eyes fixed on the table. "People are going to talk, Evelyn," she said. "Your father has spent his life building a name in this town." My father did not look at me. He looked at the paperwork. This is what happens when stubborn people confuse ownership with judgment. Preston laughed softly from the corner. 6 months, he said. Then you'll be calling Dad to bail you out. The escrow officer shifted in her chair and asked if I wanted a moment. I did. Not because I doubted the station, but because some foolish part of me still wanted one of them to ask whether I was scared. Nobody did. So I picked up the pen. My hand stayed steady as I signed every page. When the stamp came down, Preston stopped smiling for half a second. I think he heard it too. It did not sound like paperwork. It sounded like a door opening from the inside. The door opened, and then the weather came in. That is the part nobody tells you about owning something broken. The deed feels powerful for about one afternoon. Then the rain finds the roof. The breaker box hums like it is thinking about dying, and the first estimate arrives with a number so large it makes your stomach go quiet. Miller's Cross did not become mine gently. The first week, I found raccoons nesting above the old office ceiling. The second week, a windstorm tore a strip of flashing loose over the service bays and sent water down the inside wall in a dirty brown line. The restroom pipes knocked whenever I turned on the sink. The first garage door rose 6 inches and froze there, stubborn as a jaw. I worked my regular job until 5, drove 40 minutes to the station, changed into old jeans in the back room, and worked until my arms shook. I scraped gum from under counters. I hauled out cracked display racks and mouse-chewed boxes of oil filters. I swept broken glass, peeled sun-baked stickers off windows, and learned that old diesel does not leave concrete just because you want a fresh start. At night, I sometimes slept on a folding cot in the office because driving back felt like wasting gas I could not afford. I kept a notebook on the counter with 3 columns: urgent, possible, and later. The roof lived under urgent. New signage lived under later. Heat moved back and forth depending on the temperature. No one from my family came by. Not once. My mother sent one text that said, "I hope you're being careful," which in her language meant, "I hope you come to your senses before people notice." My father said nothing. Preston posted a photo from one of Dad's clean new job sites, all fresh lumber and hard hats, standing where everyone could see him belong. I saw it while eating peanut butter crackers for dinner under a flickering fluorescent light. The first person who treated the station like it might have a future was Jasper Klein. He pulled in one Tuesday morning, in a dented blue Ford older than most marriages, stepped out slowly, and stood looking at the building with his hands on his hips. He was 71, thin as a fence post, with a mechanic's stoop and eyes that missed nothing. "You, the Carver girl who bought Miller's?" he asked. I braced for the joke. "Yes." He nodded toward the garage doors. "Those tracks aren't dead. They're just packed with rust and old grease." Then he looked at the cracked windows, the stained concrete, the sagging sign, and smiled like he could see another building underneath this one. "This place isn't finished," he said. "It's just been waiting on somebody stubborn enough to listen." I did not know then that Jasper was not the only thing the old station had been waiting to show me. The first thing Jasper fixed was the garage door, though fixed was too generous a word for what he did. He brought a coffee can full of old rollers, a socket set, and the kind of patience I had never seen in a Carver man. For 2 hours, he worked the track loose inch by inch, wiping out rust-colored grease with a rag from his back pocket. When the door finally rolled all the way up, the sound filled the service bay like the building had cleared its throat for the first time in years. Behind the second bay was a narrow storage room I had barely touched. It looked like every other forgotten corner of Miller's Cross. Warped shelves, a dead wasp nest, boxes of curled receipts, and a smell like dust baked into oil. Jasper stood in the doorway longer than he needed to, staring at the far wall. "That paneling wasn't here when I worked this place," he said. "It was cheap brown plywood, swollen at the bottom from old water damage." I slid my fingers under one loose edge and felt a ribbon of cold air move against my knuckles. Jasper handed me a pry bar without making a speech. The first sheet cracked loose, and dust jumped from the shelves. Behind it was not insulation, not studs. There was a narrow door painted the same dull color as the wall, with a rusted latch and a brass plate so dark I almost missed the words stamped into it. Records. Inside was a room no bigger than a pantry, but it held more than the whole station seemed worth the day I bought it. Metal filing cabinets lined one wall. Rolled maps sat in a wooden rack. A gray lockbox rested on a shelf. Its key was not hanging in plain sight. I found it 20 minutes later, taped beneath the shelf in a brittle envelope yellowed with age. That night, I sat at the counter with a flashlight, unfolding old paper one page at a time. Utility diagrams from 1962. A certificate for a deep commercial well. Electrical service approvals. And then a stamped access easement, drawn in blue ink across the west side of my parcel. I knew enough to know. I did not know enough. The next morning, I took the folder to the county records office. Naomi Bell read the pages twice, pulled microfilm, then went quiet. "This easement was never vacated," she said. "It had been indexed under the station's old parcel name before the highway was rerouted. Anyone searching only the back acreage could miss it." Naomi tapped the blue line. "Anyone who wants commercial access behind you needs this route. And this route runs through you." That was when I saw it clearly. My father's next project, Preston's, bragged about development, the road they needed but did not own. My father had called Miller's Cross a corpse. But hidden in those papers was the only airway his next project had left. Knowing what the easement meant did not make me rich, it made me careful. For 2 days, I carried those copies in my work bag like they might burn through the fabric. I wanted to call my father. I wanted to hear the silence on the other end when I told him the daughter he had dismissed was sitting on the route his next project needed. But I had spent too many years in loud Carver rooms to mistake impulse for power. Information only helps you if you protect it first. So I made copies, put the originals in a safe deposit box in Topeka, and went back to work. Not the dramatic work. The real kind. I renamed the place Mile 56 Motor Stop because Miller's Cross still sounded like a property waiting to be buried. The new name gave it a mile marker, a purpose, a small claim on the road. Jasper helped me get one service bay usable. Not pretty, just functional. We cleaned the lift, replaced cracked hoses, and found a semi-retired licensed electrician willing to trade a weekend of permitted repair work for 6 months of free oil changes. I reopened with one bay, one coffee urn, 2 vending machines, and a hand-painted sign that said, "Restrooms clean, coffee hot, tires checked." It was not glamorous. It was barely enough, but it was open. The first month, I lost $3,900. The second month, I lost $2,100. I wrote the numbers in my notebook without flinching, because numbers do not insult you. They tell you where the leak is. I cut hours. I changed suppliers. I stocked the wiper blades and coolant drivers actually bought, not the products that looked pretty on a rack. Then Peeler Dawson walked in during a rainstorm with a cardboard box of apple hand pies and a pride so bruised I recognized it before she said a word. She had closed her bakery after the pandemic and was baking out of her sister's kitchen, selling to anyone who would answer a text. I gave her the old cashier counter on a trial basis and told her rent could wait until she made money. By the third week, drivers were asking if the pie lady was there. By the sixth, they were calling ahead. Coffee changed the smell of the building first. Then cinnamon. Then hot biscuits on Saturday mornings. The old diesel never fully left the concrete, but it stopped being the only thing the place remembered. Slowly, Mile 56 became somewhere people stopped on purpose. Not many at first. A county road crew, a cattle hauler, 2 nurses coming home from night shift. Every receipt felt small until I stacked them by week and saw the line rising, not like a miracle, but like something alive deciding, inch by inch, to stand. By the spring of 2023, Mile 56 was no longer quiet in the mornings. The garage door rattled up at 6, Pilar's coffee started before sunrise, and Jasper had taken to sitting near the first service bay with a clipboard as if retirement had been a misunderstanding. We were not famous. We were not rich. But we had regulars. And after years of being treated like a problem someone else had to solve, regular felt like a kind of mercy. Marcus Ellery came in on a Thursday because one of his drivers told him our restroom was clean enough to make a man emotional. I did not know who he was at first. He wore jeans, a gray work jacket, and boots dusty from a yard somewhere, not the polished shoes my father's business friends liked to wear when they wanted people to know they had never carried anything heavier than a pen. He ordered black coffee, one of Pilar's sausage biscuits, and stood by the window looking out at the old highway for a long time. "You own this whole parcel?" he asked. I nodded, careful by habit. Free and clear, he turned toward the service bays. "And that west access road." My hand tightened around the rag I was holding. "It's recorded." That was all I said. Not because I distrusted him exactly, but because I had learned that a paper advantage should never be volunteered before you know who is asking. Marcus smiled a little, like he respected the answer. Then he handed me a business card. Ellery Regional Freight. I knew the name. Half the delivery trucks running produce, medical supplies, and farm equipment across central Kansas had his logo on the door. "I've got drivers losing 40 minutes a day cutting through the interstate mess," he said. "What you have here is not just a stop, it's a hinge." No one had ever called anything I owned a hinge before. My family had called it a wreck, a liability, an embarrassment. Marcus walked the property with me for 40 minutes and saw water, power, turning radius, driver rest space, and room for fleet service. He saw use where everyone else had seen rust. 3 weeks later, he came back with a letter of intent. A month after that, a travel blogger posted a video about Pilar's Pie, Jasper's hand-painted tire sign, and the cleanest little motor stop on old US 56. By Sunday night, it had crossed 1 million views. By Tuesday, people were driving 20 miles out of their way for breakfast. That afternoon, my phone lit up with Preston's name for the first time in nearly a year. He had not asked once if I needed help fixing the roof. But now he texted, "Heard your little station is getting attention. We should talk." By the time Preston texted me, I had already learned to distrust any sentence from my family that began with, "We should." "We should talk" usually meant I should listen. "We should be reasonable" meant I should surrender something. "We should think about the family" meant someone had found a way to make their problems sound like my duty. I did not answer him that day. 2 mornings later, my mother arrived with a covered dish in both hands, as if casseroles could soften property law. She stepped inside just after the breakfast rush, when the air still smelled like coffee, warm butter, and fryer oil. Her eyes moved over the fresh paint, the framed permits, the drivers sitting near the window, Pilar wiping down the counter, Jasper arguing gently with a farmer about tire pressure. I watched her take it all in, and for the first time, I saw confusion under her manners. She had come prepared to pity me. Instead, she found customers. "This is nicer than I expected," she said. I almost smiled. "That's not a high bar, Mom." She set the casserole on the counter and lowered her voice. "Your father is worried. Things are moving fast here, and he thinks you may not understand how complicated this could become." There it was. Concern dressed in its Sunday clothes. Before I could answer, my father's truck pulled into the lot. Preston's SUV followed close behind. They had not come together by accident. Russell Carver walked in wearing a sport coat, not work boots, and looked around mile 56 the way a man looks at a piece of land after learning it is worth more than he guessed. Preston stayed half a step behind him, pretending not to study the contracts clipped to the board near my office door. Dad did not call it a wreck this time. He called it an interesting family-adjacent asset. I let the phrase hang there, until even Marianne looked uncomfortable. "We can help you structure this properly," he said. "Liability, expansion, tax exposure. A property like this belongs inside a company, not sitting on one person's shoulders." "You mean your company?" I said. "Our company," Preston corrected too quickly. I looked at him. Funny, I don't remember being included in that word. His mouth tightened. Dad stepped in before he could answer. He offered $120,000 for the property, nearly double what I had paid, he said, as if saying nearly made the insult generous. I thought of the safe deposit box in Topeka, the easement, Marcus's letter of intent, the west access road running through my land, like a quiet spine. "No," I said. My mother touched my sleeve. "Evelyn, don't let pride ruin an opportunity for everyone." I gently moved my arm away. "That's the difference between us," I said. "You still think this is about pride. I know it's about access." For the first time that morning, my father stopped pretending he was there to protect me. By the spring of 2025, Mile 56 had an office with glass walls, a real desk, and a view of the west access road my father had pretended not to care about. I used to sit there early in the morning before the first trucks rolled in, watching the light come up over the gravel and the service bays, trying to remember the woman who once slept on a folding cot because she could not afford the gas home. Some days, I could still feel her in my bones. The call came from Preston on a Monday. Not a text this time. A call. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me wanted to hear what panic sounded like when it wore my brother's voice. "We need to come by," he said. "Who is we?" There was a pause. "Dad, Mom, me." I looked through the glass at Marcus Ellery's trucks lined along the far edge of the lot, drivers moving in and out with coffee and foil-wrapped biscuits. "Is this about the access road?" Another pause, longer this time. "Just let us come, Evelyn." They arrived 40 minutes later looking like people who had rehearsed humility in the car and still found it uncomfortable. My father's face had thinned since the last time I had seen him up close. Preston's tie was crooked. My mother held no casserole this time. That, more than anything, told me they were afraid. I did not meet them in the cafe area. I did not sit at one of Pilar's tables where my mother could soften the room with family language. I brought them into my office and closed the door. Behind me, clipped to the wall, were the expansion maps for Mile 56, the Ellery freight agreement, the county permits, and last year's gross revenue report, $742,000. I had not put them there for my family, but I did not mind that they had to look at them. Preston started first, because cowards often rush to sound useful. "The bank is reviewing Dad's West parcel loan," he said. "They're saying the commercial access assumption is not valid without your easement release." "My easement release," I repeated. Dad's jaw tightened. "The lender wants it corrected within 72 hours. And if it isn't?" No one answered. So I did it for them. They call the loan. My mother closed her eyes. Preston swallowed. It's $4.6 million, Evelyn. If they call it, we lose more than the parcel. Then he said the sentence I had waited 5 years to hear, though hearing it gave me no pleasure. You can save this family with one signature. I looked at him, then at my father. No, I said quietly. I can save your project. Don't confuse the two. For a moment, after I said it, nobody moved. Outside the glass, a truck backed toward the service bay, its reverse alarm faint through the office walls. Pilar laughed at something near the counter. Life kept going on the other side of that door, ordinary and warm, while my family stood in front of my desk, trying to turn 5 years of contempt into an emergency I was supposed to solve. My father recovered first. He always did. Evelyn, he said, using the careful voice he once saved for nervous lenders, this is not the time to punish people. I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was familiar. In my family, consequences were always called punishment the moment they reached the person who deserved them. I'm not punishing anyone, I said. I'm protecting what I built. Preston leaned forward. You're really going to let the company go under over a driveway? It is not a driveway, I said. It is recorded commercial access attached to my parcel. You know that now, because your lender finally read the file. His face flushed, but he had no answer. My mother folded her hands in her lap. Your father is asking for help. No, I said gently. Dad is asking for control with better manners. That was when I opened the lower drawer of my desk and took out the folder Celeste Vance had prepared 3 days earlier. Celeste was a land use attorney in Topeka, sharp enough to make silence feel expensive. I had called her the day after my father first used the words family adjacent asset. She had reviewed the deed, the easement, the title history, Marcus's agreement, and every document Naomi had helped me confirm. I slid 3 copies across the desk. These are my terms. My father did not touch them at first. Preston did, because he had always been too impatient to hide fear well. The first condition was simple. Carver Commercial Properties would sell the rear strip bordering mile 56 to my company at an independently appraised market price, not a family discount, not a backroom number. The second was annual access fees for any commercial traffic using my west route. The third was Preston's removal from management of the West Parcel project. The fourth was a written correction, signed by Russell Carver, stating that the Maple Ridge failure had resulted from an unauthorized submission made against documented internal warnings. My mother whispered my name like I had broken something sacred. I looked at her and said, "No one in this room gets to call the truth cruel just because it arrived late." My father finally picked up the papers. His hands were steady, but his eyes were not. "You planned this," he said. I nodded. "Yes, that is what people do when they have spent years being underestimated. They learn to prepare." The signing happened 46 hours later, not at my father's office, not at Carver Commercial Properties, and not in any conference room where his name was already on the wall. Celeste insisted on that. If they wanted access through mile 56, they could come to mile 56 and sit where the paperwork finally told the truth. By 9 that morning, the small meeting room behind my office was full. Celeste sat to my right, with her laptop open and a pen lined squarely beside it. Across from us were my father, my mother, Preston, and the bank's commercial loan officer, a woman named Dana Whitcomb who looked like she had not slept much either. Marcus Ellery stood near the back window with his arms folded, quiet but present. Naomi Bell had come from county records with certified copies in a blue folder. A notary sat at the end of the table, her stamp already out. No one called it family business that morning. They called it what it was. A recorded access agreement, a land purchase contract, a management removal addendum, a written correction of prior company records. My father read every page slowly. Preston read nothing carefully and kept looking at the bank officer as if she might rescue him. She did not. Every few minutes, Dana checked her watch. At one point, Russell tried to change the annual access fee into a one-time payment, and Celeste did not even blink. "No," she said. He looked at me then, expecting maybe softness, maybe blood to do what leverage could not. I said nothing. That silence cost him more than any sentence I could have spoken. 20 minutes before the bank's internal deadline, my father signed the land sale agreement. Preston signed the removal addendum with a hand so tense the pen scratched through the paper. Then came the correction letter. That was the one that changed the room. Russell Carver, who had spent years letting people believe I had failed Maple Ridge, signed a statement saying the submission had been made against documented warnings from Evelyn Carver. My mother turned her face toward the window. I did not. I watched the signature land, not because I needed revenge, but because some truths deserve a witness. The notary stamped each page. Celeste scanned the full packet. Naomi confirmed the easement filing instructions. Dana made one phone call to the bank and said, "The access issue is resolved." Just like that, the disaster they had brought to my office became a transaction. When it was over, my father stood and adjusted his cuffs, as if dignity could be straightened by hand. Preston would not look at me. I gathered my copies into a folder and slid it into my desk drawer. For once, the Carvers had come into a room expecting me to fold, and they were the ones who left with less than they came in carrying. After they left, the room did not feel triumphant. It felt clean. That surprised me. I had imagined, during all those years of being dismissed at dinner tables and conference tables, that being proven right would arrive like thunder. I thought there would be a rush in it, some bright satisfaction that would make up for every time my father looked through me, every time Preston laughed, every time my mother asked me to make myself smaller so the family could look whole. But the feeling was quieter than that. It was the sound of the garage door opening at 6 the next morning. It was Pilar setting out fresh biscuits before sunrise. It was Jasper tapping the side of the first service bay with his knuckles, listening like the building had a heartbeat. It was Marcus's drivers coming in with coffee orders memorized and mud on their boots. It was the West Access Road carrying trucks across ground my family had once considered too worthless to respect. The rear strip became part of Mile 56 by the end of that summer. We added a driver lounge, 2 more service bays, a small dispatch office, and charging stations near the far fence. Pilar expanded from one counter to a real kitchen. Jasper refused the word employee and accepted technical advisor, only because I put it on a mug. I kept one framed photograph near my desk. The station, the week I bought it, windows gray with dust, sign sagging, concrete stained dark from years of neglect. Visitors sometimes asked why I kept such an ugly picture in a beautiful office. I told them it reminded me not to confuse appearance with value. My father never apologized in the way people imagine apologies. He did not sit across from me and say he had been wrong. Men like Russell Carver are more comfortable signing documents than naming wounds. But he stopped calling Mile 56 a mistake. Preston stopped making jokes when I entered a room. Sometimes that is not healing. Sometimes it is only proof that a boundary is working. My mother came by on a rainy Tuesday, months after the expansion opened. She ordered coffee from Pilar and stood for a long time by the window, watching trucks move along the access road. "The family misses you," she said softly. I wiped down the counter beside her. "The door is open, Mom. It always has been." She turned toward me with that old tired sadness. Family should stay together. I looked around at the place I had built from rust, paper, debt, and stubbornness. Then family should stop deciding who gets to matter. She did not answer, but she stayed long enough to finish her coffee, and that was enough for that day. They had called my old gas station worthless because all they could see was what time had damaged. I stayed long enough to see what time had protected. Sometimes the thing your family calls your failure is not the end of your story. Sometimes it is the first ground you ever stand on without asking permission. The lesson Evelyn's story leaves behind is simple, but not easy. Sometimes the people closest to you are the last ones willing to see your value. Family can be a shelter, but it can also become a room where everyone has already decided who you are allowed to be. The successful one, the reckless one, the responsible one, the disappointment. And if you hear those names long enough, you may start carrying them, like they were written into your bones. But they are not. Your worth is not measured by who claps when you begin. It is not decided by who laughs when you take your first risk. And it is not erased because someone in your family needs you to stay small, so their version of the story still makes sense. Evelyn did not win because she shouted the loudest. She won because she stayed. She learned the ground beneath her feet. She protected her papers. She repaired what others mocked. She built slowly, honestly, and with enough patience to outlast the people who only knew how to judge from a distance. That is resilience. Not the shiny kind people post about. The real kind. The kind that wakes up tired and still unlocks the door. The kind that counts losses without calling itself a loser. The kind that turns an old gas station, an old wound, an old family insult into a place where something new can breathe. And maybe that is the deeper truth. Healing does not always look like a perfect apology. Sometimes it looks like no longer needing one. Sometimes it looks like letting people visit your life without handing them the keys again. So if there is a place in your life that someone called worthless, maybe look again. It might be your beginning. It might be the ground that teaches you how strong you really are. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated by your own family, only to prove them wrong later? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if this story spoke to you, please like, subscribe, and stay with us for the next one.